My best friend is about to lose everything because he can't say no to his wife, and it's tearing him apart. I've known Jake for over a decade. We met in high school, bonded over our shared love of music, and spent countless weekends getting into the kind of trouble you can only get into when you're young and stupid. He was my closest friend, the kind of guy who would give you the shirt off his back without a second thought. But now, at 27, Jake's life is falling apart, and I'm watching him drown in a mess that he never saw coming, all because he can't stand up to his wife, Sarah. It all started when Jake was 19. He met Sarah on Tinder, and things moved fast, too fast. She was beautiful, charming, and had a way of making Jake feel like he was the center of the universe. After just a few months of dating, Sarah announced that she was pregnant. She swore up and down that she was on birth control, specifically an IUD, but somehow it had failed. Jake was stunned, but Sarah convinced him that everything would be okay. She was religious and adamant that they do things the right way, so they got married in a rushed ceremony and bought a house that neither of them could afford. From the beginning, it was clear that Sarah was used to getting what she wanted. She didn't drive, didn't work, and didn't contribute to the household in any meaningful way. Jake, on the other hand, was working 60-hour weeks at a chemical factory, trying to keep up with the mortgage payments, car loans, and the mountain of debt they had accumulated from their whirlwind wedding. He was drowning, but Sarah didn't seem to notice or care. Jake's days became a never-ending cycle of work, stress, and exhaustion. He'd come home to a messy house, bills piled up on the kitchen counter, and Sarah demanding more of him. She wanted a nicer car because their old one wasn't safe for the baby. And of course, Jake gave in. He always gave in. I tried to talk to him, to tell him that he needed to set some boundaries, but Jake would just shrug and say, "It's easier this way." Things went from bad to worse when Sarah's birth control failed again, and baby number 2 came along. Jake was forced to drop out of school to work even more hours, and his dreams of getting a better job and a better life were put on hold indefinitely. He looked tired all the time, dark circles under his eyes, stress lines that hadn't been there before, and a look of defeat that broke my heart. But every time I tried to bring up his situation, he brushed it off. "I have to be there for my kids," he'd say, as if that was the only thing keeping him going. I could see the toll it was taking on him. He was constantly stressed, barely sleeping, and whenever he did get a day off, he spent it running around, trying to keep the house together. Sarah, on the other hand, seemed content to let Jake shoulder all the responsibility. She didn't cook, didn't clean, and spent money like they were living in luxury. I'd find Jake complaining about her spending habits, but he never actually said anything to her about it. He just kept working harder, trying to keep up with the impossible demands. Then, a third child came along. Another failed birth control, another mouth to feed, and even more pressure on Jake to provide. He was maxed out in every way, financially, emotionally, physically. He'd already sold his plasma multiple times just to scrape together enough money for groceries, and he was dangerously close to losing it all. But still, Sarah didn't seem to grasp the severity of their situation. She continued to demand more of Jake's time and energy, and when he tried to explain that he couldn't keep taking days off, she'd guilt him into staying home anyway. I remember the last time I saw Jake before everything truly fell apart. He was sitting at his kitchen table, surrounded by unpaid bills and empty coffee cups. He looked like he hadn't slept in days, and his usually cheerful demeanor was replaced by a vacant stare. "I'm out of options, man," he said quietly, his voice barely above a whisper. "I've maxed out every credit card, I'm behind on the mortgage, and if I miss another payment, we're going to lose the house. But Sarah doesn't care. She just wants me here, and I don't know how to say no." It broke my heart to hear him talk like that. This was my best friend, the guy who used to light up any room he walked into, and now he was barely holding on. I tried to tell him once again that he needed to put his foot down, that he needed to tell Sarah no for once in his life. But Jake just shook his head, his eyes full of resignation. "It's not that simple," he said. She'd leave, take the kids, and I'd never see them again. I'm stuck, and there's nothing I can do. And then it happened. The final straw that pushed everything over the edge. Jake had used up all his paid time off before their third baby was even born, and when Sarah refused to let anyone else help her, Jake had no choice but to take unpaid leave. The bills kept piling up, and Jake found himself facing the harsh reality that they were about to lose either the car or the house. He needed the car to get to work, so the choice was clear. I got the call from Jake late one night. His voice was shaky, and I could hear the exhaustion and defeat in every word. "I lost the house," he said, the weight of it all crashing down on him. "They're foreclosing, and we have to be out by the end of the month. I told Sarah this would happen, but she wouldn't listen. I don't know what to do, man. I'm losing everything." I didn't know what to say. Part of me wanted to scream at him for not standing up to Sarah, for letting things get this far, but I knew it wouldn't help. Jake was trapped in a toxic cycle, unable to break free from the constant demands and manipulation. He had tried so hard to keep his family together, but in the end, his inability to say no had cost him everything. I tried to offer solutions, but Jake was too overwhelmed to think straight. He was desperate, scrambling to find a way to keep a roof over his family's head, but the damage was already done. The foreclosure notice was final, and there was no going back. I offered to let him and his family stay with me for a while, but Jake refused. He was too proud, too ashamed to accept help, even from his best friend. Jake started picking up extra shifts at work, but it was too little too late. Every penny he earned was already spent before it even hit his bank account. Sarah, meanwhile, continued to live in her own world of denial. She refused to downsize her spending, still ordering takeout several nights a week, and insisting on buying new clothes for the kids, even though they didn't need them. Jake tried to talk to her, but she would just brush him off, accusing him of being dramatic. "We'll figure it out," she'd say casually, as if their whole world wasn't crumbling around them. One night, I got a frantic call from Jake. He was sitting in his car, parked outside a rundown motel, where he'd booked a room for the night because Sarah had kicked him out after another argument about money. "I can't do this anymore," he said, his voice thick with exhaustion and despair. "I've done everything I can, and it's never enough. She just doesn't get it. She doesn't care." I drove over to meet him, finding him slumped in his car, his eyes red and puffy from crying. He looked completely broken, like a man who had given everything he had and still lost. We sat in silence for a long time, neither of us knowing what to say. Finally, Jake spoke, his voice barely above a whisper. "I love my kids, man. I'd do anything for them, but I don't know how much more of this I can take." Jake told me about the latest fight, how Sarah had demanded that he take another day off to help with the kids, even though he'd already missed work multiple times that month. When he tried to explain that they couldn't afford it, she exploded, accusing him of not caring about his family. She even threatened to leave, saying that if he wasn't going to be there for her, she'd find someone who would. "She's just using the kids to control me," Jake said bitterly, wiping his eyes. "She knows I won't say no because I don't want to lose them, but I can't keep doing this. I can't keep working myself to death just to watch it all fall apart." I wanted to tell Jake that he needed to put his foot down, that he needed to stand up to Sarah and make her understand the gravity of their situation. But I knew that wasn't what he needed to hear right now. He was already drowning in guilt and shame, and the last thing he needed was another lecture. Instead, I listened as Jake poured his heart out, admitting things he'd never told anyone. He confessed that he felt trapped in his own life, that every day felt like a losing battle. He loved his kids more than anything, but the constant pressure and lack of support were wearing him down. He felt like a failure, like he was letting everyone down, and no matter how hard he tried, he couldn't catch a break. "I don't know who I am anymore," Jake said, his voice cracking. "I used to have dreams, you know. I wanted to go back to school, get a better job, maybe even start my own business one day. But now, all I do is work and worry. I'm so tired, man. I don't know how much longer I can keep this up." It was heartbreaking to hear. Jake was one of the most hardworking, selfless people I knew, but Sarah had turned his life into a never-ending cycle of demands and sacrifices. She manipulated him with guilt, using their children as leverage to keep him under her thumb. And the worst part was, Jake couldn't see a way out. He was so deeply entrenched in his role as the provider that he couldn't imagine putting himself first, even for a moment. I tried to encourage him, reminding him that he wasn't alone and that there were people who cared about him. I told him that he deserved better, that he deserved to be happy and not constantly burdened by someone else's expectations. But Jake just shook his head, a defeated smile on his face. "It's too late for that," he said. "I made my bed, and now I have to lie in it." A few days later, I got another call from Jake, this time in the middle of the night. Sarah had finally realized the severity of their financial situation, but instead of taking responsibility, she blamed Jake for not working harder. She berated him for letting them get into this mess, ignoring the fact that she had spent their money like it was endless. Jake was at his breaking point, and I could hear it in his voice. "She told me I was a terrible husband and father," Jake said, his voice shaking. "She said I wasn't doing enough, that I was failing our family. I can't keep fighting her. I'm so tired and I feel like I'm losing myself. I don't even know what to do anymore." I tried to be there for Jake as much as I could, but it was clear that things were spiraling out of control. He was running on empty, and no amount of encouragement could change the fact that he was trapped in a toxic, one-sided relationship. Sarah's relentless demands had pushed him to the edge, and he was losing everything he had worked so hard to build. As the foreclosure date approached, Jake's anxiety grew worse. He started missing more work, unable to focus on anything other than the impending loss of his home. Sarah continued to spend recklessly, refusing to acknowledge the reality of their situation. She still wanted to live in a fantasy where everything was fine, where Jake could magically fix their problems with sheer willpower. But there was no magic fix this time. The damage was done. As the foreclosure date loomed closer, Jake was running out of time and options. He was scrambling to find any way to make enough money to keep the house, but every attempt fell short. He applied for payday loans that only put him deeper in debt, sold whatever he could from their home, and even resorted to pawning off some of his personal belongings, things that held sentimental value just to scrape together enough for a single mortgage payment. It was never enough. Sarah's denial of the situation was maddening. She continued to act as though nothing was wrong, planning playdates, ordering takeout, and even browsing online for a new stroller she just had to have. Every time Jake tried to confront her with the reality of their situation, she'd dismiss him, telling him he was being dramatic. "Just work a few extra hours," she'd say, as if he hadn't already been working himself to the bone. When Jake pointed out that he was on the verge of losing his job because of all the time he had taken off, she'd roll her eyes and complain about how he wasn't supportive enough. I kept trying to get Jake to stand his ground, to put his foot down and tell Sarah that things needed to change. But Jake was terrified. He was scared of losing his kids, scared of what Sarah might do if he ever said no, and most of all, scared that he'd be left with nothing. Every time he came close to telling Sarah that they couldn't afford her spending habits, she'd turn on the waterworks, guilt-tripping him into submission. "If you loved me, you'd make it work," she'd say, and Jake would crumble, unable to withstand the emotional manipulation. The final blow came when Jake's boss called him into his office. Jake had been missing shifts, coming in late, and his performance was slipping. He was given an ultimatum: get it together or lose the job. Jake was devastated. This job was the only thing keeping them afloat, and now even that was at risk. He tried to explain the situation to Sarah, pleading with her to let someone else help with the kids, to cut back on spending, to do anything that would give him the space to keep his job and their house. But Sarah's response was cold and dismissive. "You're just making excuses," she said, her voice dripping with disdain. "If you can't provide for us, then what good are you?" It was like a slap in the face, and Jake was left reeling, wondering how the woman he married had turned into someone so callous and unfeeling. He was on the brink of losing everything, and she couldn't even muster an ounce of support. As the foreclosure date finally arrived, Jake was out of options. They packed up what little they could fit in their car and moved into a cramped apartment that they could barely afford. Jake had to beg his boss to keep his job, promising that he would never let his personal life interfere with work again. But the damage was done. He was no longer the dependable, hardworking employee he once was. He was a man hanging by a thread, doing everything he could to keep his family together, even as it fell apart before his eyes. The apartment was a far cry from the home they had lost. The kids were confused, asking why they couldn't go back to their old rooms, why they didn't have a backyard to play in anymore. Jake did his best to keep things normal for them, but every day felt like a battle. Sarah continued to act as though none of this was her fault, blaming Jake for not working hard enough, not earning enough, not being enough for their family. She refused to acknowledge her role in their downfall, and Jake was too beaten down to argue. I watched as my best friend, the guy who had always been so full of life and ambition, slowly faded away. He was a shell of the person I once knew, weighed down by guilt, stress, and the never-ending demands of a wife who refused to take responsibility for anything. Jake started drinking more, not enough to be dangerous, but enough to take the edge off the constant anxiety and despair. He confided in me that he didn't know how much longer he could keep going like this. "She's never going to change," Jake said one night, as we sat on my porch, nursing beers and staring out into the darkness. "And I'm too afraid to leave. She's got me trapped, and I don't know how to get out." It was hard to hear, knowing that there was nothing I could say or do to fix it. Jake was caught in a toxic loop, giving everything he had to a woman who only took and never gave back. He was too scared to leave, too beaten down to fight back, and too worn out to see a way forward. All I could do was be there for him, to remind him that he wasn't alone, even when it felt like the walls were closing in. Jake's story didn't have a happy ending. He didn't miraculously find a way to save his home or stand up to Sarah and turn his life around. He was still stuck, still struggling, still giving everything he had just to keep his head above water. But through it all, he never stopped loving his kids, never stopped trying to be the best dad he could be, even when everything else was falling apart. And as much as it hurt to watch him suffer, I knew that his love for his children was the one thing that kept him going, the one light in the darkness that he clung to when everything else seemed hopeless. I wish I could say that Jake found his way out, that he finally stood up to Sarah and took control of his life. But the truth is, some people never get that chance. Some people, like Jake, are trapped in cycles they can't break, bound by fear, guilt, and the relentless weight of responsibility. All I can do is hope that one day, Jake finds the strength to put himself first, to realize that he deserves more than the life he's been forced to live. Until then, I'll be here, ready to help him pick up the pieces whenever he's ready to start over. A few weeks after the move, Jake called me late at night, sounding more defeated than ever. Sarah had just unleashed another tirade, blaming him for their current situation. She was angry that they were living in a small, run-down apartment, that she didn't have the car she wanted, and that their lifestyle wasn't what she had envisioned. Jake tried to explain again that he was doing everything he could, but it was like talking to a wall. Sarah didn't care about the facts. She only cared about her own needs and wants, and Jake was always the one to blame when those weren't met. She said, "I'm failing as a husband and father," Jake told me, his voice breaking. "I'm working 70 hours a week, and it's still not enough. I'm exhausted. I don't even have time to see my kids anymore, and when I'm home, I'm so stressed I can't even enjoy being around them. I don't know what to do." Listening to him was gut-wrenching. I wanted to help, but I was out of ideas. Jake's entire life had become a cycle of relentless work and emotional abuse. Sarah's manipulation kept him tethered to a sinking ship, and Jake's fear of losing his children kept him from standing up to her. He was stuck, and it seemed like there was no way out. One night, Jake and I met up for drinks, something we hadn't done in a long time. He looked worse than ever, his face gaunt and his eyes hollow. He was surviving on caffeine, stress, and the occasional stolen moment of sleep. As we sat there, Jake started talking about his dreams, the things he had wanted to do before his life had spiraled into this endless nightmare. "I used to have all these plans, you know?" he said, staring into his drink. "I wanted to go back to school, get a degree, maybe start my own business someday. But now, I can't even think about tomorrow, let alone the future. I'm just trying to get through each day without falling apart." It was the most vulnerable I'd ever seen Jake, and it broke my heart. He had always been the strong one, the guy who could handle anything, but now he was barely hanging on. I tried to encourage him, reminding him that it wasn't too late to turn things around, but Jake just shook his head. "I can't leave her," he said, his voice filled with resignation. "She'll take the kids, and I can't lose them. They're the only thing that makes all of this worth it. I just have to keep going, no matter how hard it gets." I wanted to argue, to tell him that staying in this toxic relationship was only hurting him more, but I knew it wouldn't make a difference. Jake was trapped, not just by Sarah's manipulation, but by his own sense of duty and love for his children. He couldn't see a way out that didn't involve losing the one thing he cared about most, and that fear kept him chained to a life that was slowly destroying him. As the months went by, Jake continued to spiral. His work performance continued to suffer, and he was constantly on the brink of losing his job. He stopped talking about his dreams, stopped mentioning any hope for the future. Every conversation was about how tired he was, how much pressure he was under, and how nothing ever seemed to get better. I tried to be there for him, but it was hard to watch my best friend slowly fade away. Then one day, Jake called me with some unexpected news. Sarah had left, taking the kids and moving in with her parents. She had finally realized that Jake couldn't provide the life she wanted, and instead of working through their problems, she had bailed. Jake was devastated, but there was also a strange sense of relief in his voice. For the first time in years, he wasn't being pulled in a million different directions. He was alone, but at least he wasn't being suffocated by Sarah's constant demands. "She said she needs time to figure things out," Jake told me. "She's angry that I couldn't give her everything she wanted, but honestly, I think this is the best thing that's happened to me in a long time." It was bittersweet. Jake missed his kids terribly, but he finally had some breathing room. He started going back to therapy, trying to unpack the years of emotional abuse and manipulation he had endured. He was still struggling, still trying to piece his life back together, but there was a glimmer of hope that hadn't been there before. Jake began to make small changes, picking up hobbies he had long abandoned and reconnecting with old friends. He started looking into finishing his degree, taking online classes when he could, and slowly rebuilding his sense of self. It was a long road, and there were days when he felt like giving up, but for the first time, he was doing something for himself. Sarah's absence was a constant reminder of how much he had lost, but it also highlighted how much he had gained. Jake wasn't completely free. He still had to navigate the complexities of co-parenting and deal with Sarah's occasional outbursts. But he was no longer trapped in the relentless cycle that had consumed him for so long. He was learning to stand on his own, to set boundaries, and to prioritize his own well-being. One afternoon, Jake and I met up for coffee, and I could see that spark in his eyes that I hadn't seen in years. He was still tired, still carrying the weight of everything he had been through, but he was fighting back. He was reclaiming his life, one step at a time. "I'm not where I want to be yet," Jake admitted, a small smile playing on his lips. "But I'm getting there, and that's more than I ever thought was possible." It wasn't the happy ending I had always hoped for Jake, but it was a start. He was no longer drowning, no longer suffocating under the weight of someone else's expectations. He was finding his own way, rebuilding his life piece by piece, and slowly but surely, he was becoming the person he had always wanted to be. Jake's journey was far from over, and there were still countless hurdles ahead. But for the first time in a long time, he was free to choose his own path. And that, more than anything, gave me hope that my best friend would be okay in the end.